Okay, so typically when I start these episodes, I begin with a series of questions, and that's to help us locate ourselves in whatever the topic is, to define terms, to make sure we have some sense of shared meaning as I'm going through all of this, and most importantly, to remind us that we're telling stories here, that we live in this big world of the unknown, and all the meaning making that we do, all the beliefs that we have are stories that we're putting on top of the unknown. So all of this that we talk about on this podcast in life, like it's our best guess. And these best guesses are one of the ways that we try to do better, potentially. So when I first started outlining this episode, which is about fighting, I stumbled across a quote about fighting fair by John Steinbeck. And he said, "If you find yourself in a fair fight, your tactics suck." And I'm obsessed with this quote now because it made me really question, if we get rid of all of the idealism around why we fight, like, oh, I just want to understand the other side and we just want to come to a reasonable agreement. If we actually talk about why it is that we're fighting, why do we fight? Are we even trying to have fair fights? Or are we trying to annihilate the other person? Are we trying to prove that we're right? Are we trying to prove that they're wrong? Are we trying to win? Are we trying to get our way? And how often are we actually fighting to understand each other rather than just defend ourselves? So there's this idea, I'm mad and sad, so now I need to make you mad and sad because you made me mad and sad. And it feels more like a takedown a lot of the time, like this big cathartic release. Feels like it's this, I heard this analogy from one of my teachers where we have all this emotional garbage, right? And we don't want to deal with it. And so instead of us dealing with it, we just huck it onto the neighbor's lawn. Like, now you deal with all this garbage. And sometimes that's what it feels like in a fight, right? Like, I'm just trying to give you my emotional garbage because I can't handle my agitation. And it's your fault I feel this way anyway, so you deal with it kind of energy. So my question for you this time is, are you down to stop fighting to not lose and instead try to learn to fight to win? And what does winning a fight even mean to you? Hi, this is Sara Russell. I'm a relationship coach, dancer, and Taoist. In every episode, I'll be talking about psychedelics, well-being, or the human experience. And this one is on how to fight fair. Okay, I'm going to tell you something that sucks about learning how to fight fair. People kind of sort of hate it in the beginning. The people who are learning how to do it kind of hate it, and the people who are on the receiving end of you learning how to fight fair hate it. Because like I just said, like often these fights are these huge explosions where then we get to have all of this release. And culturally, we're addicted to this cycle, this kind of roller coaster of lows and highs where we get into a huge fight with someone. And then if we're in a long-term committed relationship of any kind, we come back together and there's the celebration and the connection and wow, like we just made it through that thing. And then we crash again and then we lift ourselves out of it again. And it's this really like addictive cycle, like I said, of highs and lows. And when we learn to fight fair, we're going to go through a little bit of withdrawal around that, because all of a sudden you're not getting those big chemical hits of drama that mean, because there's such big energy, you love me so much. So we're smoothing that out a little bit. The other thing is you don't get to use all those witty, snarky, clever, self-esteem takedowns of the other person where you get to absolutely crush them and prove to them how terrible they are and how correct and righteous and intelligent and moral you are. So you don't get to do all of that. All those like clever little things you come up with in your head, like you just can't say them anymore. And then I gotta say, one of the hardest side effects is in learning how to fight fair is sometimes the people that you're fighting with start to think that you care less because you're not being as emotional, right? This idea that this big emotional display means that you're in it with them. And if you're not in it with them emotionally anymore, then you don't care as much as they do. So as you learn to recenter and stay calm and state your case clearly and cleanly, the other person can start to feel like you're less involved in some way. And the other really hard side effect of learning how to fight fair is that as you start becoming more centered and calm in your fighting, you can start looking like the rational, logical one, and then the other person can start feeling like they're the emotional, irrational, unreasonable one, and they can start feeling really one down. And in the middle of a fight, if somebody goes one down, starts feeling less than in some way, that can also make the fight spiral. So don't you want to learn how to fight fair now after all of that? But I promise, yeah, it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of energy. It takes a lot of time. But if you're willing to go the distance and learn this very challenging skill set, it does smooth things out, and we are able to treat each other with respect and dignity, and we're able to disagree from a place of compassion and understanding rather than persecution and vitriol. And so trust me, y'all, it's worth it. These tools that I'm going to be sharing with you come from Claude Steiner. So back in the 60s, 70s in Berkeley, Claude Steiner and Marshall Rosenberg, that might be a name y'all recognize, would sit on the couch with Eric Berne, who did transactional analysis, and they were both studying under him, right? And Marshall Rosenberg went on to create nonviolent communication. And if you've ever trained in any kind of communication style where you're trying to de-escalate a fight in some way or be more compassionate in some way, it's likely the method that you learned was nonviolent communication. Claude Steiner came up with something, which is cooperative communication, and then Julia Kelleher and Nancy Shantou of Skills for Change added their tools and resources to it. And so because they have this common, like grandpapa of cooperative communication, right? Like Eric Berne, transactional analysis and all that. There are similarities between cooperative communication and nonviolent communication, but there are also important distinctions. And you're going to see my bias here towards cooperative communication. Because in nonviolent communication, one of the things that's assumed is that both parties need equal time. And in cooperative communication, we don't do that. We're actually doing a power analysis, and that's what makes us different, is we're going, who has what power in this transaction, who's more marginalized in this situation, who's experienced more harm, who's under more distress. That person might need more time. They might need more support. And so in cooperative communication, we're not going for equal. We're actually going towards more of an equity versus an equality kind of dynamic where we're trying to give each person what they need rather than give each person the same thing. So that's one of the distinctions between cooperative communication and nonviolent communication. And there are all these steps to cooperative communication. I'll get into a few of them today. But before we begin any of the steps, it's really, really important that you have your yes and you have your no. Your no protects your yes. You can't actually say yes to something if you can't say no to something, right? If you have to say yes, it's not actually a yes, it's coercion. So you have to be able to have your no. And in order to have your yes and have your no, you have to have some idea of what you want. And this is where it gets tricky, right? Because if you're in the middle of a fight, guess what? Your fight, flight, freeze, fawn, dissociative survival response is kicking off. And the part of your brain that holds complexity, that can hold the contradictions in your wants, maybe you want competing things in your own body, the ability to hold nuance, to be able to see it from somebody else's perspective, all that goes dark in your brain when you're in fight, flight, freeze, fawn, dissociative response. And so your ability to know what you want goes offline. And all of a sudden you're just trying to protect yourself and keep yourself safe. So it's really hard to know what you want once you're triggered. You're just trying to avoid pain. So we want to have our yes and have our no and know what we want. But in order to be able to do all of those things, we need to be able to get centered. Centered meaning having some sense of calm, your heart rate's not elevated, your breathing's not super chaotic. And I'm not implying that in the middle of a fight, you're supposed to all of a sudden be Zen Buddhist master, right? You can still be mad. You can still be sad, you can cry, you can be exasperated, but you can still hold complexity, right? You can still hear what the other person is saying. You're not just like immediately trying to interrupt them. You're not just immediately trying to discount them. There's this spaciousness that happens when you're coming from a place of centered. And we want to be centered as much as we can in a fight. We want to be coming to a fight cold, right? Not with this like hot, raging, vengeful, fierce, fiery energy. We want to be able to come to it fairly cool. In order to be able to do that, we have to track our energy levels, because if your energy is low, if you're depleted, the likelihood that you're going to be able to come up with a fantastic creative solution that works for all parties that's sustainable is minimal. It's super low. And so you want to make sure that your energy is as good as it can be. You got a good night's sleep. You're not hungry. You're not dehydrated. You've managed your stress. taking care of anything stressful that you need to. That might be a desensitization practice like going for a walk or getting outside or having a cup of tea, something to help you regulate in some way. And then you also want to be tracking when you're triggered. Because if you get triggered, again, that part of your brain that's going to be able to cooperate and negotiate and be compassionate is going to go offline. So you want to be tracking your triggers. The way I like to track for triggers comes from the BDSM community. Thank y'all for everything you've done for the safe, sane, consensual movement. And the BDSM community has this system of green, yellow, red, right? Where green is, yeah, bring it. I want more. It's a yes, full go, full steam ahead. A yellow is, I'm not sure, like proceed with caution. Please be careful, go slowly. And then a red is, nope, that's a no, full stop. Everything needs to come to a halt right now. And so I like to do this for my triggers as well, right? So when we're in the middle of a conversation, oh yeah, like I'm feeling easy in my body. I feel like I can still hear what you're saying. I'm still really clear on what I want to say next. I'm not getting too lost. Green, we can keep having this conversation. Yellow, your tone of voice or your body language, that look in your eye, or something that you said, or you said something that I didn't like. Now I feel a little something, like I'm a little tense. I'm a little constricted. I'm starting to talk a little faster. Or I'm starting to go nonverbal. Go slow. Like we're going to gently proceed through this to see if we can actually continue having this conversation or not. And then red is you're triggered, you're flooded, you're overwhelmed, you're exhausted. You need to take a break. Full stop. Pause. Do not proceed. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. So practicing that ability to say, I need to take a break is going to be super important to be able to fight fair. Something else that's really important in fighting fair is no drive-by fights. When somebody is all of a sudden blitzrigged and they didn't know they were going to be in the middle of something chaotic or confusing or contentious, the fight's not likely to go as well. So you want to make sure you're getting consent before you get into a fight. So an example of this is years ago, I lived in a house full of people, and I have a strong desire for privacy. And one of my housemates had a strong desire for sharing. They wanted to know what everybody was doing all the time. I tended to like to keep my life really private. So I was on my way to teach a dance class. I would leave the house at a specific time because I knew how long it took me to get to the studio. There was a certain amount of time that I wanted to set up my music and get the room ready before my students came in, like center myself before I started teaching. And then obviously starting class on time so I could greet the students and the parents as soon as they showed up. I had a protocol for what I like to do, and it was timed, right? Like all of this was scheduled out. So I'm on my way downstairs to go out the front door, and my housemate, who always wanted to know everything, starts yelling down the stairs, asking me if I knew what some of the like packing regulations were for getting on a flight. And I was like, actually, I'm on my way to work. Now's not a good time. I put my hand on the door to open up the door, and they said, well, I just want to know whether or not, like, is it okay if you bring candles on a plane? And I was like, I don't know if it's okay if you bring candles on a plane. I imagine it's okay if you bring candles on a plane, but I gotta go. And they're like, well, can you just like look it up? Can you just like figure this out with me? And I was like, I can't, I gotta go to work. I opened the door and I left. 5 minutes later, I get this text, you BIT, how dare you disrespect me that way? I was like, oh, wow, like I'm on my way to work. I didn't want to have this conversation to begin with. And it was a complete drive-by, right? Versus if that person had had a conversation with me, hey, I'm feeling really stressed about an upcoming trip. It would really help me if you could help me organize this. When would be a good time to talk about this? Are you available to talk about this? And I would have been like, sure, after I'm done teaching, I'm going to be home around this time. Let's sit down. Let's figure out what you need to know. But that's not what happened. So what I just described was a meta conversation. And a meta conversation is the conversation about the conversation. And what that means is you get to go, hey, I want to talk about this topic. What's it going to be about? I want to talk about my upcoming trip and how to prepare for it. So then I know, like, we're about to have a conversation about what? Then when would be a good time to talk about it? So we're going to talk about the time, right? So topic and now time. I need to figure it out in the next 3 days. Do you think you'll be able to figure out a time when we can talk about it then? Then the duration. I think it's going to take about half an hour to figure it out. So it's not just this kind of, like if you've been in those fights where they go on and you're like, oh, there was this drive-by comment. And then that comment, it was kind of a joke, but it was kind of prickly. Now we're in the middle of a fight. Now this fight's gone on for an hour or 2 hours or the next day. Hate it. And also like lots of compassion. I understand why it happens. But so like, how long do you think it's going to take? And then sticking to that timer. So if you say half an hour, it doesn't turn into a 2-hour conversation. And then the last piece of a meta conversation, or at least one more piece of a meta conversation, is how intense is this for you? So for instance, I'm super stressed about packing for my trip. I'm like at a 7 right now. I'm so anxious about it. I'm like, oh, like this is really intense and this is really important for you. I'm going to prepare for a conversation with a person who's at a 7 very differently than I'm going to prepare for a conversation if the person's like, yeah, I'm at a 2. And if the conversation doesn't happen, like I'll probably be okay, but I would prefer that it did. So topic, time, when would be a good time to have it, duration, how long it's going to last, and intensity, like how important is this conversation to you? So notice we haven't even started talking about the thing yet. There's all of this preparatory work on the front end. No wonder people don't do this. And we're not taught how to do this, right? Unless you're like trained in cooperative communication, which you can be if you want to be, highly recommended. But like, it's a lot of effort, right? Like we haven't even gotten to talk about the thing we want to talk about yet. And if you're super agitated and emotional and distressed, like it's hard to do all this work on the front end and not just dive right in because you want to feel better. Unfortunately, I'm going to give you more pre-steps rather than what happens during the actual fight. Ugh. Okay, so you also want to establish ground rules. And ground rules can be everything from like, how do we manage this conflict? For instance, how do you feel about interrupting or being interrupted? Some people hate to be interrupted. They think it is so rude. They think it is so disrespectful. They think you're not listening to them. Some people don't mind being interrupted because they're like, I can remember what it was that I was thinking about and I can circle back to it. That's fine. So how do you feel about being interrupted? And then how long does each person get to talk? Because does somebody just get to word vomit for as long as they want to, like spewing all of their emotions all over you for as long as they want to? Or do you want to set what your capacity is, what your limit is for that, right? Like, okay, like I can listen to you being tearful for about 10 minutes, but after that, like it's too hard to see you in pain for that long. And like, I'm going to need to respond in some way. And if you just keep talking and talking, I'm going to forget my responses. Although, tip here, like I do recommend taking notes during fights. I know that feels super school marmish, but rather than interrupting somebody if they really hate it, or like if you're worried you're going to forget what you're going to say, it's okay to write it down. Like use your tools. You don't have to be superhuman in all of this. It's hard enough. Something else you might want to establish, I highly recommend you establishing as a ground rule, is how does each person feel safe in the conversation? So this can be things like no name calling. This can be things like how do you feel about slamming doors? Also setting that it's okay to leave if somebody gets overwhelmed, right? People need to be able to walk away if it gets too hot. If somebody is getting flooded, if somebody is overwhelmed, if somebody is exhausted, they need to be able to say, I need a break. So we have so much agitation in our bodies when we're in the middle of a fight. We just want to do anything we can to solve it, to fix it. So we will push through and grit through trying to find a solution. But it like the conversation just continues to devolve as we do that. And I know there's like this huge trend right now around attachment theory, right? Secure attachment, anxious attachment, avoidant attachment. And all my avoidant peeps out there, I see you because y'all get a lot of shit culturally if you're an avoidant personality type, because it's this idea that you're like a commitment phobe, or you're just like running away, or you're not willing to communicate or cooperate, when really like being able to leave if you can't have a conversation in that moment is totally fine. And like, I'm going to highly advocate for it. Now, it's not the same thing to like storm out without saying anything, slam a door with no indication that you're going to be open to a future conversation. That's really different than, wow, I need a break. Can we come back to this later? And I know for my anxious personality types out there, that can be really hard, right? Because we're trying to foster connection. We're trying to feel close. We're trying to feel safe in some way. And so that can be really scary. But that moment where there's kind of this distancer pursuer dance, as the distancer gets more distant and the pursuer pursues more intensely, has that ever felt good for anybody involved in those dynamics? No. So being able to take a break, and again, sometimes we're too overwhelmed to be able to be super verbal in those moments, but the more we can be like, hey, I'm going to take a pause. We'll come back to this later. People need to be able to walk away. People need to be able to leave the room. People need to be able to take a walk, whatever it happens to be. Part of that means that you trust the relationship enough that it doesn't need to have this sense of immediacy and urgency to it. Right? This idea that if we don't solve it right now, it's going to be a crisis for the relationship. We're never going to be able to recover. Do you actually trust each other enough that there's enough time, that you don't need to solve it in one conversation? That if you have an ongoing relationship, the likelihood that that's going to continue is high because if you care about each other. And so can you take as much time as you need so that people can be centered, so that people can be clear, so that people can have their yes and their no without needing to force it as if the whole world is going to burn if it doesn't get solved right now. Now, sometimes there's a real emergency. And so, take care of it if you need to take care of it. But if you can pause, I highly recommend pausing. Easier said than done, because the level of agitation in our bodies can feel really intense, but I don't want the resolution of the fight to be what solves the agitation in your body. I want you to be able to come back to center and have enough practices that you can be okay even before the fight is resolved, right? You might still feel uncomfortable or sad or angry or any of those little kind of feelings, but you don't have to be a black belt emotionally in these fights. You can get thrown off center, go, I need to take a pause, and then come back to it. It can be messy and it can have a stop start. It doesn't have to be this super smooth, perfect performance where you're hitting all the marks. You're going to get agitated. It's really hard when somebody's mad. It's really hard when somebody's sad. So don't expect yourself to be, robotic in this. You're human and we affect each other. We have mirror neurons that are bouncing off each other. So there's going to be an impact when somebody's upset with us. So allow yourself time to move through all of that. Okay. The other thing is be really clear about your for the sake of why. Why are we about to have this fight? So what are the goals of this fight? What's the outcome that I'm hoping for? And again, I feel like sometimes we fight because it's I just feel so terrible that I don't know what to do with all this terrible. So I'm going to try to pass the terrible over to you. Then we make the other person feel terrible. And then we just keep passing it back and forth like this toxic game of tennis. So you may have a goal of, I need to say what I'm feeling and I need to say what I'm feeling and be seen and heard and understood. You can ask for empathy, but that's really different than I'm just going to rage at you because I'm mad and I want you to be mad. I just want you to know that what you did hurt. And the other person will probably have feelings about that. They may feel defensive, but being able to do that from a place where we're naming it and we're not doing it in this persecutorial way. We're not doing this way you're bad. It's just you did something and it didn't work for me. You may also want to negotiate new agreements. You may need more information about a situation. Maybe you're a little bit confused about what happened, or you feel like you're telling a story, but you don't have all the pieces. And so you need more information before you can tell a more complete story. You may also want to give or receive feedback in some way. And by doing this, we're being really clear about why we're willing to engage in something that's not going to feel good, right? Fighting doesn't feel good. We don't at the end of a fight go, well, that was so fun. I can't wait to do that again. No, we're constantly trying to figure out ways where we can do it less or do it more smoothly or do it in a way that doesn't feel so disruptive in some way. Okay. So I just want to be really clear. This is part 1 of how to fight fair, right? I haven't even gotten into what happens in the fight yet. There's a whole other protocol I can give you for what happens when you're in the middle of a fight. But do your homework. That would be my advice, and figure out what are your yeses, what are your nos, what do you want? How do you get centered? Do you recognize when you're triggered? How do you indicate that you're triggered? What practices do you need to build in your body so that you can take space when you need to take space? What do you need to practice in order to be able to pause and not feel like you just need to burn through a conversation? This is a lot. But even if you just learn how to recenter, even if you just learn how to pause, your fights are going to go so much better. Thanks for listening. For more information, you can find us on Instagram at drinkmudwater. Also, go to trendswithbenefits.com for all of our articles on psychedelics, well-being, and the human experience. And my listeners, I'm so glad I can offer you a 20% off code for your next order of Mudwater. You can use the discount code TWB20 for 20% off your next order. And by doing so, you're helping support this podcast and the content I'm creating. And as a reminder, we're adding a new format to this podcast that's specific to relationships. So if you have a relationship question, something you would like me to talk about during this podcast, record a voice memo. Try to keep it under a minute. You can use the voice memo app on your phone and tell me what it is you would like me to talk about. And I'll go through your questions and I'll give you the best advice I can, as much support as I can on this podcast. Good luck. Fair fighting, and may the odds be ever in your favor.